Meyer Lansky. He has been called the accountant of the Mafia and the financial genius of the criminal underworld. His fortune at the height of his power was estimated at $300 million, and he was the second man in the national crime syndicate, which united all the key gangsters of the country. This is the legend of Meyer Lansky, created by journalists and law enforcement. If you are curious to know what is true and what was created to sell more newspapers, then please welcome Meyer Lansky on the other side of the law. The name Meyer translates as bringer of light. Perhaps Max and Yetta Lansky, naming their son like that, wanted to predetermine his fate. Alas, as time has shown, the ship sailed quite differently from what it was called. But in 1902, in the extremely religious Jewish community in the town of Grodno, which was located in the Russian Empire at the time, nothing could indicate what the newborn Meyer would become. He, like most of the boys in the settlement, was educated in Heder and dreamed of becoming a rabbi. But his dreams were not destined to come true. Since the end of the 19th century, there has been a wave of anti-Semitism in the Russian Empire, which led to constant clashes between Russians and Jews, where the latter were in a clear minority and received little or no protection from the state. And the Jews began to leave in droves. Palestine and the United States were their main routes of relocation. Meyer's grandfather and grandmother took the first route, but his father went to conquer the New World in 1909. In little more than a year, he was on his feet, and in the spring of 1911, he was joined by his wife and children. Initially, the family, who shortened their last name and began to call themselves Lansky, settled in Brownsville, but due to a lack of money, moved to the cheaper Lower East Side. Meyer was 10 years old at the time of the move, but because he did not know English, he had to start his education in first grade. However, Lansky proved to be an extremely capable pupil, and by 1914, he was transferred to grade 6, proving himself a solid honor student. As Meyer himself would later confess, he enjoyed attending school, and especially the math lessons, which he was already trying to apply at such a young age, not only in the classroom, but also in matters not quite legal. In the neighborhood where his family settled, people played dice almost every step of the way, and little Meyer loved watching it and trying to calculate the odds of the number he was betting on. Every day, he increasingly succeeded in guessing the result, and eventually, he decided that he needed to take a chance and multiply the money his mother gave him to buy food for the whole family. Of course, Lansky lost and put his family in a very difficult situation. A whole week because of this action, the family, as they say, had to survive on bread and water. But this did not stop him, and Meyer continued to watch the games, but now focusing his attention not on the odds, but the players. And he noticed one interesting detail. The place he went to had the same guy playing every day. At first, he was always lucky, but as soon as the other players began to believe in his luck and bet their money on the number that this man had drawn, his luck immediately turned away from him. Although Lansky could not yet understand exactly how the numbers were rigged, he realized that the game was rigged, and this guy was a decoy. And if he wanted to win, he had to bet with this man when no one else believed in him. And when his parents sent him shopping again, Meyer bet money again. This time, his observations proved correct. He won! Now, Lansky began going to other places to watch the games, and many had the exact same scam. The secret was solved, and more money was piling up under his mattress each week. At the same time, Meyer meets Benny Siegel, with whom they organized a small teenage gang. All this, gambling plus bad company, gradually began to shift young Lansky's focus. He no longer dreamed of becoming a rabbi. Now, he did not want to repeat the fate of his father, who had never achieved anything in his life working honestly. Teen Meyer just played dice and earned as much as his father, and a couple of broken noses gave Meyer far more respect among his peers than Meyer's father received from his boss. For a young boy, not yet aware of the consequences of a life of crime, the choice of his path was obvious. At the age of 15, having graduated from the 8th grade with honors, Lansky abandoned his education. Under the pressure of his father, he did get a legal job at an auto repair shop, but by no means abandoned earning on the other side of the law as well. At the age of 18, he worked as the manager of a small illegal place where dice were played. He kept order there, and if necessary, he threw unwanted customers away. A second way for Meyer to get money was to work for the unions, which were then in constant conflict with the factory owners. Both hired gangsters to protect them by force. That's exactly what Lansky was doing. He was told who needed to be beaten up. He beat them up. He was told to start a riot at the factory. He did it. And who knows, maybe Meyer would have remained at that level of a local gangster forever, but in 1920, the U.S. government enacted Prohibition, which allowed hundreds of gangsters across the country to earn huge sums. And Lansky was no exception. The road to big money for Meyer, as well as for many other gangsters of the Prohibition era, was opened by Arnold Rothstein. It was the acquaintance with Rothstein that gave Lansky the initial access to high-quality imported goods. And the acquaintance with the big bankroll itself happened through mutual friends. By the way, I also have a video about Arnold on my channel. The business was not something extraordinary. You buy, you sell, you make a profit, you expand. At the same time, you make new acquaintances and form new alliances. In that vein, I must mention Lansky's relationship with Charles Luciano, whom he had known since childhood, and with Frank Costello, with whom he would have had close business contacts even after Prohibition. By the way, I have separate videos about both of them on my channel. As soon as you finish this video, go there. It's just as interesting. But that was not all. For otherwise, contemporaries would not have called Lansky the smartest gangster they knew. Not only did Meyer look for gold, but he also sold shovels. Or, to put the allegory aside, he, along with Ben Siegel, not only sold illegal liquor, but also had his own fleet of trucks, which he rented out along with chauffeurs to other bootleggers. And since most of the time alcohol had to be delivered from out of town, the business was wildly popular and brought in an excellent income. After all, the competition was minimal because there were few who were willing to give up their trucks without any questions, especially with drivers who would be ready to get hit by the bullets of competitors if this happens. On the whole, Prohibition had been quite successful for Lansky. Yes, he had been in a few scrapes, but he had not suffered any serious losses. Moreover, his close associates Luciano and Costello had risen rather high. The first had become the boss of a family that is taking the lead in the underworld, the Cosa Nostra, and the second is about to gain his famous political influence. Add to this the new acquaintances he has made all over the country, as well as the hundreds of thousands if not millions of dollars that Prohibition has brought in, and you have a great springboard to start doing what will bring Meyer Lansky his fame: gambling. However, he began his business a little differently after Prohibition was lifted. Along with key Cleveland bootleggers Sam Tucker and Mo Dalitz, Lansky started Molaska Corporation, which supplied dehydrated powdered molasses to the distilling industry. Powdered molasses was an inexpensive addition to sugar in the liquor-making process, and Molaska Corporation used new manufacturing techniques and was well-positioned to take the lead in supplying this component nationwide, in a niche that promised to be a boom after the repeal of the Volstead Act. But defenders of the law did add a fly to the ointment. Alcohol production after Prohibition became heavily taxed. Illegal distilleries reopened all over the country, and Lansky and his partners, instead of coming out of the shadows and legalizing themselves, went back to crime and started making deliveries to companies outside the law, for which they paid the price. When the authorities closed down one of these plants capable of producing up to 20,000 bottles of strong alcohol a day, they began to dig in the direction of the suppliers of raw materials, and in order not to get under investigation, Lansky and partners were forced to close the firm, and with the help of lawyers, to cover all traces. In this way, Meyer ruined with his own hands his first opportunity to make a living in the legal economy. Lansky had no other ideas on how to make legal money commensurate with bootlegging, and now his eyes once again fell on gambling, which had begun his acquaintance with the darker side of American society. At the time of Prohibition, Meyer already had a few places in New York where people could drink and play dice, but the scale was extremely small. You might even say these places were more for the soul than for making real money. It was impossible to organize a permanent, respectable casino in New York City because of the ban on gambling. It would certainly have been shut down. But in the resort town of Saratoga Springs, only 300 kilometers from the Big Apple, the authorities were much more accommodating, and such establishments were not uncommon here. Saratoga was mostly only visited by the extremely wealthy people, and here they had a sort of elite sanatorium. They would have breakfast in the morning, then go for massages or other wellness treatments, and afterwards, most of them would gather to watch the races. By 6 p.m., the entertainment in Saratoga was over, and the guests moved out of town to the so-called lake houses, which were luxurious restaurants with equally presentable casinos. And here, they were met by Meyer Lansky, who in the mid-1930s ran one of those gambling houses. His place, which he opened with Frank Costello and Joe Adonis, was called Piping Rock. Costello was in charge of the restaurant there, sending his best Copacabana workers there every season. Adonis drove the rich clientele that went to his New Jersey establishments, and Lansky directly ran the casino. During the holiday season, which lasted in Saratoga from June to September, the partners could make several $100,000. For Adonis and Costello, it was just one way of earning money out of many. But for Lansky, it was his only business at the time, and he needed something else that would bring in money at other times of the year. And he chose Florida, where the holiday season began just after the end of the season in Saratoga. Here in 1936, in a town called Hellendale, near Miami, a small speculator named Julian Kaufman opened a casino. In a barn where tomatoes used to be stored, he began taking bets on sporting events, and in the evenings, people could play dice, roulette, and blackjack under the sheds nearby. His business was not very successful at first, but the idea of holding daily bingo games with a grand prize of $3,000 to buy a brand new Cadillac immediately made his establishment, called Plantation, a place of attraction for those who like to try their luck. However, he was harassed by local devout residents who sued Kaufman. Now, it was forbidden for him to do business in the plantation, and perhaps Kaufman would have closed down, and Hellendale would never have seen gambling on his territory again. But at about the same time, when he was suited by a local community of high moral defenders, a man named Vincent Allo came to him and made an offer he could not refuse. Allo, also called Blue-Eyed Jimmy, was a member of the Genovese family, and also he was Lansky's closest friend in the Mafia. He ordered Kaufman to let a few more people in, and in return, the new partners promised to solve the problem with the locals and to make a cash infusion into the establishment, turning it into a more respectable place. And these partners, as you may have already realized, were Vincent Allo himself and Meyer Lansky. Kaufman, realizing that it was better not to refuse orders from such people, gave his consent. After that, he got a share in the firm and handed over all control to Lansky and Allo. The first thing Meyer did after receiving the new establishment was to deal in the lawsuit. The court order stated that the plantation must cease operations on the land in question. Therefore, Lansky simply gave a new name to his casino, The Farm, and moved it to a neighboring site, technically circumventing the injunction. However, the locals could win the lawsuit again, and something had to be done about it. Meyer began by donating en masse to every community in Hellendale, from cops and doctors to fishermen and hunters. This calmed the discontent a little, and Lansky went above and beyond, organizing with the local authorities a perfect system of corruption. Every week, there was a trial for hooliganism in the local court, and the fine imposed on the accused, which went into the coffers of the municipality, was paid by the farm. The amount of the fine bribe was determined in advance between the authorities and Meyer. Likewise, throughout the holiday season, Lansky sponsored subsidies from City Hall for each local family in the amount of $35 a week. And on top of that, he provided dozens of jobs for Hellendale residents and provided a market for local farmers, buying food for the restaurant strictly from them. In short, he opened a gold mine for the people of Hellendale, and the people who had previously lived extremely poor decided that gambling was not such an evil, and the local authorities never saw any casinos in their jurisdiction. Naturally, the profits from the former tomato barn weren't enough to keep everyone happy, and the farm became a more luxurious and presentable brother of the plantation. Lansky built game rooms, opened a restaurant, and began attracting new investors there. So, in the season when Meyer was already in full charge of the establishment, a hotel was opened and the beach was arranged, with all the amenities of civilization in the form of changing cabins, showers, sun loungers, and lifeguards on duty. Later, a local racetrack was opened in Hellendale. Lansky wasn't the only one who tried to create all the conditions so that as many guests as possible came to the farm. America itself, which by the end of the 1930s had finally recovered from the Great Depression, was doing everything to make Florida's coastline a gold mine. People were starting to make good money again, and Miami and its surrounding towns became the best place for them to vacation in the winter. And along with the way tourists were choosing Florida for vacations, investors were choosing it for new investments. From 10 to 20 hotels in the late 1920s, there were more than 100 in 1939. And just as many people in Saratoga went to the lake houses after their daytime treatments. People here went to the beach houses. Here they served the best food and best drinks and provided an opportunity to lose $1,000 or $2,000, having experienced this wonderful surge of adrenaline in the blood. Tens of thousands of people came to Miami for recreation, and thousands of them chose gambling as their evening pastime. By and large, it was Las Vegas before it was Las Vegas, and Meyer Lansky, having bought a former tomato storage shed without knowing it, made probably the best deal in his life. But Meyer tried not to get hung up on one successful business and took on everything that allowed him to expand the number of ventures and gambling income. So in the early 1940s, he learned that in the town of Council Bluffs in Iowa, the local government failed in its attempt to organize a large-scale fair. The authorities were left with a vacant building and $12,000 in debt to creditors. Lansky flew to Iowa and offered the following terms to the woeful officials. They would rent the fairgrounds building to him to hold dog races. In return, he agrees to pay them $1,000 in rent every week of the race. On top of that, Meyer built the track and bleachers at his own expense, which were to become the property of the city 5 years after the lease ended. Officials agreed to such generous terms, and in the summer of 1941, the track, called Dodge Park, was open to the public. Lansky made his money from this by taking bets on the races. And to get around the gambling ban, all the booths where people could bet their money didn't take those very bets but sold options. And the whole track was filled not with gamblers, but with investors. If they won, they could sell their option back to the same place where they bought it, but with an increased value. If a person lost, then his option ceased to be worth anything at all. And despite the fact that such a scheme was like a spit in the face of the law, nobody touched Meyer, because the money they needed so much was going into the coffers of the Council Bluffs. About the same time that Lansky was operating in Florida and Iowa, he made his first business visit to Cuba, where Batista, who had seized power in the early 1930s, was unhappy with the island's gambling situation. The newfound dictator in 1937 transferred some of the gambling businesses to state control and was disappointed with the way they operated. Fraud, poor service, and incompetent employees year after year scared away the American gamblers who were the mainstay of the industry. And to remedy the situation, Batista instructed his staff to find Americans to help them. The first to accept the job was Lou Smith, the famous horse racing manager of the time. But Smith knew only his field, and therefore advised Batista to hire Frank Erickson to work with bookmakers and Meyer Lansky to work with the casinos. Smith was well acquainted with them and could vouch for them. Lansky accepted Batista's offer and in 1938 worked the winter season for two sides. On one side was Hellendale, with a well-established operation, and on the other was Cuba, where everything had to be broken down and rebuilt in terms of management systems. To do this, Meyer brought in a team from the States and fired all of the past staff. The newly hired Cuban staff worked the entire season with Lansky's team, who supervised and trained them. And the result of such drastic measures was that the Casino Nacional, which Lansky took over, was transformed beyond recognition, once again becoming a favorite place for American tourists. Batista was pleased, and Meyer therefore committed himself to Cuba for a long time, where he could do what he loved and not worry about regulations and prohibitions. Here, he could be legal. But in America, where Lansky had the bulk of his gambling business, the authorities were beginning to get tougher on gambling, and very soon it would bring Meyer a huge pile of problems. The period from the mid-1930s to the late 1940s, barring a break during World War II, was Meyer Lansky's own personal golden age of gambling. A casino in Saratoga, a casino in Florida, dog racing in Iowa, and the start of work in Cuba. And by the late 1940s, that list was yet to be joined by a share in a luxury hotel casino in Las Vegas, built by his longtime friend Benjamin Siegel, nicknamed Bugsy. From 1931, Nevada was the only state where gambling was legal. And from the early 1940s, large-scale hotel casino projects began to appear there. In 1941, when Siegel turned his attention to Las Vegas, a resort complex with a casino, called El Rancho Vegas, had already been built there. And the Hotel Casino Last Frontier opened a year later. These institutions had everything you could need for recreation: comfortable rooms with air conditioning, swimming pool, tennis courts, and most importantly, a casino with all kinds of gambling. Thanks to these institutions, Vegas began to attract more and more people every year, some of whom even stayed in town to live. And Siegel, who was in the betting business here, began to see the prospect of hotel casinos. And in 1943, he tried to buy El Rancho Vegas, but was flatly refused by the owner. Instead, in 1945, he managed to buy a smaller establishment called El Cortez, and Lansky invested $60,000 in the venture, receiving a 10% stake. Just a year later, in 1946, Siegel sold El Cortez, capitalizing on the post-war rise in real estate prices. He made about $170,000 on it, and building on his success, he persuaded his gangster partners to invest in building a new hotel that would be more luxurious than any in Las Vegas. Eventually, this hotel, called the Flamingo, caused a conflict between Siegel and the partners, who then killed Bugsy. Whether or not Lansky knew of the impending assassination attempt is not known, but he still owned 10% of the hotel after his childhood friend's death. In the future, according to the FBI, Lansky would also have a stake in casinos called the Petrel, the Sands, and the Horseshoe. When Siegel first started this venture, Meyer did not believe in it and gave money to Bugsy only because of an old friendship. Lansky believed the infrastructure of Vegas was in a deplorable state. There was no air travel, and a car ride through the desert was still an adventure. Apparently, he was dead wrong, and Vegas was feeding him for a long time, especially after he lost all the casinos outside Nevada. This was because a wave of gambling discontent swept across America in the early 1950s. People were no longer exhausted by the problems of the economy and increasingly began to think about moral issues. And in response to these popular demands, politicians began to appear across the states who wanted to make a career out of fighting gambling establishments. Even the most famous Senate hearings of that decade, led by Estes Kefauver, put the issue at the top of the list. And all that noise paid off. In the past, Lansky could simply buy people and run a casino in peace. Now, they wouldn't even talk to him. and dog racing in Iowa, a gambling establishment in Florida, a casino in Saratoga, all were shut down within a couple of years. Moreover, the Kefauver hearings, to which Meyer was similarly summoned, brought him to the attention of law enforcement, and in 1952 he was indicted for conspiracy, gambling, and forgery in the Erode Inn case, where Meyer had helped Joe Adonis. Lansky's lawyer, Moses Polikoff, was confident that he could get away with it, but his client adamantly refused to go to trial because then he would have to testify publicly, which he absolutely did not want. His testimony could indirectly implicate his partners, and Meyer decided to plead guilty. In the end, Polikoff was able to get Lansky charged only with forgery of documents, which was that the liquor license listed a frontman and not Meyer himself, making the sentence extremely lenient. Lansky paid a $2,500 fine and served a brief 3 months in jail. Upon his release, Meyer found himself at a loss. All of his casinos were shut down. The attempts he made to legalize himself by renting jukeboxes and TV sets to bars failed. And in Cuba, after Batista lost the 1944 elections, things did not go well at all. However, Batista retook power in 1953, which meant that Cuba was Lansky's main opportunity to get back in the big gambling business, especially given that Meyer continued not to fully believe in Las Vegas. Meanwhile in Cuba, a scandal erupted when an American lawyer connected with Senator Richard Nixon was scammed at a casino for a local game called Cubolo. He, in turn, refused to pay. This resulted in a public lawsuit, which the lawyer won. After that, a series of complaints swept across the states from other American tourists who had been cheated in Cuba at Cubolo. Batista took this issue under his personal control because he considered gambling one of the main sources of states' income and, of course, his own income too. And in the inspection that his people conducted, which fully coincided with an independent investigation by American journalist Lester Velli, it turned out that there were only 2 establishments throughout Havana where they did not cheat. The first is where the locals play among themselves, and the second, called Montmartre, had just recently been taken over by Lansky, who has done a total sweep there. Batista immediately remembered an old acquaintance who had helped him set up the Nacional Casino nearly 15 years earlier and offered Meyer a position as his advisor for $25,000 a year. Lansky was supposed to help reform gambling, thereby ridding Havana of the fame of dishonest casinos. Of course, Meyer agreed. It was probably what he had been striving for all his life, to get recognition and the opportunity to work legally at what he did best. And by the 1954-55 season, Batista, with Lansky's advice, had managed to completely stamp out cheating in Havana's key gambling houses. In addition, he made a series of reforms aimed at making it easier for American tourists to enter Cuba. These measures have greatly increased the number of visitors from the States, who can now stay in Cuba without a visa for a month and no longer fear that they await a fraud on every corner. Lansky, meanwhile, in addition to advising Batista, was developing a small gambling club called Montmartre and hatching the idea of opening a casino in Havana's most luxurious hotel at the time, the Nacional. Not to be confused with the Casino Nacional, which Meyer had worked on 15 years earlier, they are different establishments. Lansky suggested the idea to Batista, and he approved. And since the hotel belonged to the government, in 1955, one wing of the luxurious 10-story Nacional was converted into a gambling complex with a restaurant, bar, and casino. And the management of the new establishment was entrusted to Meyer. But it wasn't exactly what Lansky dreamed of. Most of all, he wanted to have his own casino here in Cuba, where his activity is completely legal because after his prison term in Las Vegas, he would never be able to work openly again. And in the same year, 1955, it became a reality. That year, the Cuban government issued a new law for hotels, under which Cuba gave tax breaks to all new hotels, motels, and similar establishments that provide tourist accommodations. Also, any new hotel over $1 million and any new nightclub over $200,000 were eligible to apply for a casino license. Lansky took advantage of this law, and in 1956 he began building his own hotel casino called the Riviera. And by the end of 1957, the 21-story building with 440 rooms was finished. The Riviera was the quintessential example of Meyer's entire gambling career. The largest, the most luxurious, the most comfortable. The Riviera incorporated all the knowledge and experience Lansky had gained over the years. It was the only one in Havana at the time that had a central, silent air conditioning system. America's best artists performed there, and the cuisine, according to many, was the most delicious in Cuba. And of course, in the Riviera, you could play any kind of gambling popular back then and know that the game wasn't rigged against you. According to the memories of hotel visitors, Lansky managed to create an elite institution where there was not even a hint of gangster affairs. It was a sort of aristocratic corner in the middle of a commoner carnival in the streets. Since December 1957, when the Riviera officially opened, its 440 rooms had not been empty all winter season. and these rooms were occupied by a very wealthy public. Because if we rely on the memories of Cuban Norberto Peña, who collected debts from lost visitors, we can assume amounts of hundreds of thousands of dollars a week, since, according to Peña, on average, he took a debt of $10,000 to $15,000 from one such losing player. At the same time, he emphasized that he never had to use force, and the money was given in cash immediately after the request to return, which indicates what kind of audience was in Meyer's casino. Lansky's personal paradise did not last long, however. At the end of 1958, Batista fled Cuba and Fidel Castro seized power, who changed the vector of development towards socialism and kicked all the casino operators off the island. Meyer and partners invested an estimated $14 to $18 million in the Riviera, but only managed to make $3 million. Lansky lost everything in Cuba: money, dreams, and even his health. After all this, his previously acquired ulcer worsened, and new heart problems were revealed. He was hospitalized twice, and everything was going to make it impossible for him to survive. But Meyer Lansky managed, as far as possible, to recover from this blow. And now, having crossed the 60-year milestone, he needed to find new strength and new goals to continue living on. At the beginning of 1962, Meyer had a heart attack, which he survived and was on the mend. And in August of that year, he decided to travel to Europe and, among other things, to visit the homeland of his people. Lansky fell in love with Israel at first sight. This tourist trip made him think seriously about leaving America, which had brought so much disappointment to him, and moved to live in a country his grandfather had dreamed of. The only difficulty was that after the fiasco in Cuba, he did not have enough money to retire safely in another country. The only noteworthy income he had left was skimming in Las Vegas, where Meyer had a 5 to 10% stake in several casinos, and it took more than a year to accumulate the necessary sum at that level of earnings. In addition, he had to make sure that the U.S. authorities did not deprive him of his last revenues, and for this, he would have to make a couple more successful investments abroad, where normally he would not have to constantly lead and his participation would be extremely difficult to prove. Casino skimming, in case anyone didn't know, is when money is withdrawn from a gambling establishment to bypass official reports. That is a kind of tax evasion. And that is what Lansky was making his money on when he lost the Riviera. Officially, though, for the IRS, he was getting money from his past legal investments. So he had an interest in several small hotels in Florida, as well as about 20% in a small oil company, State Summerfield. This was enough money for him to make his debit and credit match for the IRS, and he had no legal problems. Lansky took his real earnings out of the States in the following ways. There was a bank in Miami called the Bank of Purin, which had a special arrangement with the Castle Bank of Nassau in the Bahamas, under which the former was actually a branch of the latter. That is, you could go to a bank in Miami, put any amount on the account, and ask that the money be credited to the Bahamian bank. There was no paper trail in the American bank. All the data went straight to the Bahamas. And from there, Meyer took the money away from the U.S. tax authorities, namely to Switzerland. From there, he could freely make new investments abroad, the profits of which also ended up in Switzerland. So through old connections, he was able to obtain small stakes in Lucayan Casino in the Bahamas, as well as in a casino in London called the Colony. In this rhythm of securing his pension, Lansky would live until the end of the 1960s, during which time he would also escape punishment for skimming. The FBI would get its hands on the evidence in the early 1960s, but by the end of the decade, the defense would be able to prove in court that it was illegally obtained and the case would be dismissed. Meyer took the case as a sign and sold all his stakes in Las Vegas, making a total of about $1 million. He was now ready to retire and go to Israel, especially as another tax evasion case was being assembled against him in the States, again connected with Las Vegas. Last time, he escaped punishment for the Sands Casino. Now, the authorities were going after the Flamingo. But why were the authorities so eager to nail Lansky since the early 1950s? His 3-month prison sentence. Then the citizenship revocation case, which Meyer won, and after that the tax evasion cases, one after another. Why did they desire to lock up a simple gambling organizer? Weren't there more serious criminals on whom the FBI's forces could be directed? Of course there were, but on paper, for the authorities and society, Lansky was much more than an ordinary casino owner. And it all began when the Kefauver Senate Committee in the early 1950s identified Meyer as one of the leaders of the so-called New York crime syndicate, which, on a par with the Chicago syndicate, ran the whole country's organized crime. In fact, there were no centrally controlled syndicates. I explained it lucidly in my videos about the origin of the New York Mafia, which you can find on my channel. But at the time, the acquaintance of American society with the concept of mafia had just begun, and people imagined a terrible picture of organized crime, which created a new government and was about to take over the country. And Meyer, who had collaborated with Costello and Adonis in a number of gambling ventures, was enlisted with the pair in the leadership of the New York crime syndicate. It was like a snowball. At first, people talked that Lansky allegedly owns almost every casino in Las Vegas. Then, that Lansky removes Mafia bosses he doesn't like. And then, that he has $300 million in foreign accounts. And all this time, he remained the boss of the Eastern Crime Syndicate. All these rumors and speculations were born out of scraps and phrases that FBI agents managed to hear. Later, a mountain out of a molehill was made by journalists and writers. So, for example, the rumor about Lansky's $300 million fortune was entirely invented by journalist Hank Messick, who wrote about Lansky in the mid-1960s. Messick referred to the data of the U.S. Internal Revenue Service, answering where he got the figure from. Well, the IRS in turn denied it completely, saying that there had never been such figures in their investigations of Lansky's income. Nevertheless, when Meyer went to Israel in 1970, it was not the departure of a tired old man wishing to retire in the homeland of his people, but precisely that of the fugitive leader of one of the strongest criminal organizations in the United States. And it was this unwanted notoriety that will prevent him from staying in Israel. When Lansky went there, he thought he would be welcomed with open arms. Beginning in the late 1930s, he helped the Jewish people and the birth of the Jewish state in every way he could. He organized the breaking up of demonstrations by the Fascist Party in New York. Through his connections in the Mafia, he helped in sending weapons to Israel when there were problems at the ports, and donated on a regular basis to various Israeli foundations and organizations. However, when he came and asked for citizenship in 1970, his fame as a Mafia boss outweighed his past merits, and he was denied by the Israeli authorities. He sued the Israeli government for nearly 2 years, arguing that as a Jew he should be allowed to become a citizen, but all to no avail. And in September 1972, Lansky was ordered to leave Israel. At the same time, he was being prosecuted in the States for tax evasion. It was even taken to court, and Meyer, of course, did not attend the hearing, which automatically earned him charges of contempt of court. The U.S. authorities also revoked his passport. Now, Lansky could only legally leave Israel and go back to the States, where prison was likely to await him. But this was not the pension Meyer wanted, and he was not going to give up easily. With the help of acquaintances he made in Israel, in particular with the help of Yossi Shaner, who had been the director of security for the Prime Minister of Israel at the time of David Ben-Gurion, he obtained a visa to Paraguay, where there was no extradition to the United States at the time. And in November 1972, Lansky left Israel. First, he flew to Zurich, from there to Rio de Janeiro, where he changed planes to Buenos Aires, and finally from there he flew to Paraguay. The only thing Lansky and Shaner, who assisted him, did not take into account was that the plane from Argentina had only a stopover in Paraguay, and the final stop was in the States. So, the 2 FBI agents who boarded the plane in Paraguay simply did not let Lansky off. They were referring to the fact that just a couple of hours earlier, Paraguayan authorities had decided not to let Lansky into the country because of his legal problems. Meyer could not verify this, nor could he force his way out of the plane, so all he had to do was sit in a seat and watch the plane take off in Paraguay and then land at Miami Airport. His first court case after his return was a contempt of court trial, which he eventually won because there was too little time between the subpoena being sent and the court date, and Lansky was not physically in time to fly in from Israel. Then his health deteriorated, and in March 1973 he needed a heart operation, after which the recovery should have lasted at least a year. But the authorities were very anxious to put him behind bars, and in July of that year a trial for tax evasion began, which Lansky also won, because the prosecution had a very unreliable witness who had been caught perjuring himself by Meyer's lawyer. Left free, Lansky would try to obtain Israeli citizenship directly from the States for several more years, but it would not work, and Meyer would eventually come to terms with it, especially since all these lawsuits for almost 4 years, which began back in Israel, have almost completely depleted all of his money, savings that he was saving to live in the homeland of his ancestors. Now, he was really a regular retiree. Together with his friends like Vincent Allo or Harry Rosen, they would gather at breakfast and have long, lively conversations about the past or present, trying not to touch the future. Occasionally, they would be joined by the younger generation of Florida gangsters, who enjoyed hearing about stories of Prohibition or Cuba or Las Vegas. In the afternoon, the friends usually broke up and Meyer went home to take a nap and gain strength for the evening stroll with his beloved dog. The next day was the same, meeting his friends for breakfast, an afternoon nap, a walk, dinner, and another nap. But gradually, these joys began to leave Meyer. First, his friends began to die, and then his health began to deteriorate even more. Dizziness, memory problems, bloody cough. In 1980, Lansky was diagnosed with cancer. That same year, he had surgery to remove the tumor, but it all came back in 1982. And on January 15, 1983, Meyer Lansky finally lost his battle with death, passing away in a hospital room. This was the story of Meyer Lansky, a man who, in my humble opinion, could have accomplished far more in life than Lady Luck ultimately allowed him to.